On the evening of May 13, 1985, a police helicopter rose over the city of Philadelphia, flew to a quiet residential street in a black middle-class neighborhood in the west of the city, and hovered about 60 feet above a row house full of people, and a police officer leaned out and dropped a bomb onto the roof. Not tear gas, not a flash grenade, a bomb, an actual explosive device, built from two kinds of high explosive, dropped from the air onto a house on an ordinary American street where families lived. The bomb started a fire, and then the people in charge made a decision that turned a catastrophe into a massacre. They let it burn. They stood back and let the fire spread from the one house to the next, and the next, down the block and around the corner, while the neighborhood went up in flames. By the time it was over, 11 people were dead inside that house. 5 of them were children. The youngest was 7 years old. 61 homes were destroyed. More than 250 people, almost all of them black, almost none of them connected in any way to the standoff that started it, were left homeless, their entire street reduced to ash and rubble. An American city dropped a bomb on its own residents, in a black neighborhood, and burned that neighborhood to the ground. It happened in the United States, in a major city, in 1985, not in some distant unfilmed past, but recently enough that it was captured on live television, recently enough that the survivors are alive today, recently enough that the city government only apologized for it a few years ago, and most Americans have never heard of it. There is no other event quite like it in American history. Governments have used terrible force against their own citizens before and since, but the specific act, a municipal police department in peacetime, dropping an aerial bomb onto an occupied home in a dense residential neighborhood of its own city, stands almost alone. It is the kind of thing Americans are used to reading about in accounts of distant wars and foreign regimes, not on a leafy street of brick row houses where people mowed their lawns and sent their kids to the local school. That is part of why it is so hard to hold in the mind. The setting is so ordinary, the act is so extreme, and the gap between the two is where the horror lives. This is the story of the Move bombing, and to understand how a city came to drop a bomb on itself, you have to understand the people in that house, the neighbors around it, and the years of collision that led to a helicopter over Osage Avenue. Because this is not a simple story, and the parts that are complicated do not make what happened less monstrous. They make it more. Start with Move because they are at the center of it, and because they were nobody's idea of simple. Move was founded in Philadelphia in the early 1970s by a man named John Africa. He had been born Vincent Leapart, a black man from West Philadelphia, a Korean War veteran with little formal education but a powerful, magnetic set of ideas. And Move was the movement he built around those ideas. It is usually described as a black liberation group, and it was that. But it was also something harder to categorize. Part radical political movement, part back to nature commune, part religious family. Its members opposed technology, opposed industrial society, opposed the government and the police and the whole modern machine. They ate raw food. They rejected modern medicine. They believed in a natural way of living, and every member took the same last name, Africa, so that they became, in name and in practice, a single family. They were, by most accounts, difficult neighbors, and this is a part of the story that has to be told honestly, because it matters. Move lived communally in a row house, and their way of life brought them into constant friction with the people around them, black working and middle-class families who had bought homes on a quiet street and wanted a quiet street. Move used a bullhorn, a loudspeaker, to broadcast political statements and profanity-laced diatribes into the neighborhood. Sometimes for hours, sometimes late at night. There were complaints about trash, about sanitation, about compost and animals. The neighbors on Osage Avenue, again, almost all of them black, were not the enemies of Move in some racial sense. They were ordinary people who had been trying, for years, to get the city to do something about a situation on their block that had become genuinely unbearable. So there were two things true at the same time, and you have to hold both of them. Move was a group that many of its own neighbors found impossible to live beside, and nothing that Move did could remotely justify what the city of Philadelphia ultimately did in response. Both of those are true. The tragedy lives in the space between them, because the friction with Move was real, but the city's history with Move was already soaked in violence long before 1985, and that history is the fuse. Go back to 1978. Move was living then in a different house in the Powelton Village neighborhood, and they had already been in a long, bitter standoff with the city. That year, the police moved in to evict them, and it ended in a gun battle. In the shootout, a Philadelphia police officer named James Ramp was killed. 9 members of Move, who became known as the Move 9, were convicted in his death and sent to prison for decades, though Move always maintained the officer had been killed by friendly fire from the police themselves. And in the aftermath, there was a moment caught on camera that seared itself into the memory of Black Philadelphia. A Move member named Delbert Africa, unarmed, coming out of the house with his hands visible, was beaten by police. Officers kicked and struck with a helmet and a rifle, on film in the street. So by the 1980s, the relationship between Move and the Philadelphia police was not a dispute, it was a war. The beating of Delbert Africa mattered because of what it did to the possibility of trust. Here was footage, played and replayed, of a man surrendering with empty hands and being clubbed to the ground by officers of the law. To the police, 1978 was the year Move killed one of their own. To Move, and to a great many Black Philadelphians watching, 1978 was the year the police were caught on camera beating an unarmed man and faced no meaningful consequence for it. Both sides walked out of 1978 certain that the other was lawless and murderous, and that certainty hardened over the next 7 years into something that could not be talked down. When the two sides faced each other again on Osage Avenue, there was no reservoir of trust left to draw on, no benefit of the doubt, no channel through which a peaceful end might have been found. The bomb of 1985 was in a sense loaded in 1978. Each side saw the other as a mortal enemy. Move regarded the police and the city as murderers who had beaten their people and imprisoned their family. The police regarded Move as cop killers, and into that poisoned history walked the events of 1985. By 1985, Move had relocated to the row house at 6221 Osage Avenue, and the old pattern resumed and intensified. The bullhorn, the complaints, the fortifications, because Move, remembering 1978, had built a wooden bunker on the roof of the house and reinforced the structure, expecting another assault. The neighbors' complaints escalated, and the city, under its first black mayor, Wilson Goode, decided to act. Officials obtained warrants for the arrest of several Move members, and they decided to serve those warrants by force. To serve arrest warrants, to arrest a handful of people, the city of Philadelphia prepared for war. On the day before, May 12th, which happened to be Mother's Day, police went through the neighborhood and told the residents of Osage Avenue to evacuate their homes. Grab enough for a day, they were told. You will be back tomorrow. Families packed a bag for 24 hours and left, assuming they would return to their houses the next evening. Many of them would never sleep in those houses again. By the morning of May 13th, the block was surrounded. Roughly 500 police officers took up positions around the house. 500, for a handful of arrest warrants. They came with SWAT gear. They came with heavy weapons, including by multiple accounts, an anti-tank machine gun and thousands upon thousands of rounds of ammunition. The street was barricaded and evacuated, and in the Shawner house were the Move members, adults and children, families, holed up together, the children who could not choose where they were or what their parents believed. The confrontation began that morning. Police ordered Move to come out. Move did not. And then it escalated into a level of force that is genuinely difficult to comprehend for the arrest of people in a house. There was a gun battle, and over the course of that day, the police fired an astonishing quantity of ammunition into the house, by the estimates that came out later, on the order of 10,000 rounds in the span of about 90 minutes. 10,000 rounds into a row house in a residential neighborhood with children inside. They used tear gas. They used high-pressure water cannons, fire hoses turned on the house, trying to flood the roof bunker and force the people out. They tried to blast holes through the walls of the adjoining houses to get in, and still, Move did not come out, and the people in charge grew frustrated. And as the day wore on toward evening, they reached for a plan that no American police department had ever used against its own citizens in a residential neighborhood. They decided to drop a bomb. The idea was to use an explosive to blow the fortified bunker off the roof, to create an opening, or to force the occupants out. The device was assembled from 2 sticks of a water gel explosive called Tovex, with military-grade C4 plastic explosive added to it, a bomb. And at around 5:20 in the evening, a state police helicopter lifted off, flew over 6221 Osage Avenue, and a member of the city's bomb unit dropped the device onto the roof of the house. It exploded, and it started a fire. Now here is the part that separates the Move bombing from a botched raid. The part that turns it from a tragedy into something the city would spend decades unable to answer for. Because the fire did not have to consume the neighborhood. There were fire trucks on the scene. There were firefighters with water ready. The fire could have been fought when it was small, contained to the one house or the one roof, and the decision was made to let it burn. The commissioners and officials in charge, watching the fire take hold on the roof, chose not to immediately fight it. There is testimony that the fire was deliberately allowed to burn, that the officials in command saw the flames as a way to finally destroy the bunker and drive MOVE out, and held the firefighters back. By the time anyone tried in earnest to put it out, the fire was beyond control. It leapt from the MOVE house to the house next door, and then to the next, running down the tightly packed row of homes, jumping the little gaps between them, spreading up Osage Avenue and around onto Pine Street. A helicopter pilot, by one account, had even radioed that they did not have to drop the bomb. They dropped it anyway, and then they let the resulting fire eat an entire neighborhood. Inside the MOVE house, the people trapped in the basement were dying. As the fire raged above and around them, the adults and children of MOVE were caught in an impossible position. A burning building above them, and, they believed, hundreds of armed police outside who had been firing on them all day. Some who tried to come out later said they were driven back by gunfire. The police accounts dispute this. What is not in dispute is the result. Of the roughly 13 people inside that house, only 2 came out alive. 11 people died in the MOVE house that day, 6 adults and 5 children. Their names deserve to be said because the number 5 children can slide past you if you are not careful, and these were specific human beings. The children who died were between the ages of about 7 and 13. They had names: Tommaso, Delisha, Netta, Little Phil, Tree, the children of the MOVE family. They did not choose MOVE's fight. They did not choose to be in that house. They were children, and their city dropped a bomb on the building they were in and let it burn down around them. The 2 who survived became, themselves, part of the permanent memory of the day. It is worth stopping on the children for a moment longer, because everything about the way this story is usually told rushes past them, and they are the heart of it. The children in that house were not members of a movement in any meaningful sense. A 7-year-old cannot hold a political ideology. A 10-year-old cannot consent to a standoff with the police. They were where their parents were, as all children are. They ate what they were given, believed what they were taught, slept where they were told to sleep. Whatever anyone thought of MOVE's adults, and people thought many things, the children were simply children, and on the morning of May 13th they woke up in a house that by evening would be bombed and burned with them inside it. Any telling of this story that lets you forget that has failed them a second time. One was an adult, a woman named Ramona Africa, who escaped the burning house with burns on her body and would spend the rest of her life as the movement's voice, telling the story of what had been done. The other was a child, a 13-year-old boy known then as Birdie Africa, whose name was Michael Ward. He ran out of the inferno, naked, his body covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns, one of only 2 people to come out of that house, alive. A child, running burning from a fire his city had set. And beyond the house, the neighborhood was gone. The fire that the city let burn destroyed 61 homes, an entire section of a black middle-class neighborhood, 2 blocks of tidy brick row houses. The homes of the very people who had spent years asking the city for help with MOVE was incinerated. More than 250 people were left homeless. These were the neighbors, the families who had packed a bag for one day on Mother's Day and left, trusting they would come home. They came back to nothing, to a smoking field of rubble where their street had been, their houses, their furniture, their photographs, their Bibles and their children's drawings, and their wedding rings and every physical trace of their lives. Gone, burned in a fire the city started with a bomb, and then chose not to fight. Think about the full shape of that betrayal. The people of Osage Avenue had done everything right by the rules of the system. They had complained through proper channels. They had asked their city government for help. They had cooperated with the evacuation. They were law-abiding, tax-paying, home-owning citizens. And the city's response to their years of asking for help was to drop a bomb on their block and let their homes burn to the ground. The people who lost the most that day were not MOVE. They were the neighbors, bombed and burned out of their own homes by the government they had turned to for protection. And now the second half of the story, the part that determines whether a horror becomes a reckoning or just a wound. What happened afterward? Who was held responsible? The answer is almost no one. And that answer is its own kind of violence. The scale of what had happened was impossible to hide. It had been on live television. An American city had bombed itself. There was national outrage and there were investigations. The city convened a special commission, the Philadelphia Special Investigation Commission, which came to be known simply as the MOVE Commission, to examine what had happened. And after extensive hearings, the commission's conclusions were damning. It found that the operation had been reckless and ill-conceived. It found that dropping the bomb on an occupied row house was unconscionable. In one of its most quoted findings, the commission concluded that the deaths of the 5 children in that house were in effect unjustified homicides, that these were children killed by a decision that never should have been made. The commission found that top city officials had been grossly negligent, that the whole plan had been a catastrophe of judgment, that the decision to let the fire burn was indefensible. And then, having found all of that, having concluded that 5 children were killed in a grossly negligent operation that culminated in dropping a bomb on a house, the system did essentially nothing. No one was criminally charged, not the police commissioner, not the fire commissioner who oversaw the decision to let it burn, not the managing director, not the mayor, not the officer who dropped the bomb. Despite 2 grand jury investigations, despite the commission's blistering findings, not a single city official faced criminal prosecution for the deaths of 11 people, including 5 children, and the destruction of an entire neighborhood. The machinery that so eagerly deployed 500 officers and 10,000 rounds and a bomb to arrest a handful of people could not, in the end, bring itself to charge anyone for the consequences. Imagine for a moment the situation reversed. Imagine a group of private citizens had built a bomb, flown a helicopter over a city block, dropped that bomb on a house full of police officers and their children, and then blocked the fire trucks and let the flames spread until 11 people were dead and 61 homes destroyed. There is no version of that story in which the people responsible are not in prison for the rest of their lives. The idea is almost absurd to state, the outcome so obvious, but when the bomb was dropped by the city on its own black residents, the same act produced no charges at all. That asymmetry, the gap between what happens when the powerful do it and what would happen to anyone else, is not a side detail of the Move bombing. It is the lesson of it. There were civil lawsuits, and eventually the city paid out settlements, money to Ramona, Africa, money to relatives of some of those killed, money to the displaced residents. Years later, a jury found that the city had used excessive force and violated Move members' constitutional rights. But money is not accountability, and no amount of it brought back the 11 dead or undid the fact that the people who made the decisions walked away without charges. And the final insult came in the rebuilding. The city, having burned down 61 homes, promised to rebuild them and did. But the reconstruction was so shoddy, so riddled with defects, that the new houses were plagued with problems for years, cracked foundations and faulty construction, and eventually many were deemed uninhabitable, leading to yet another drawn-out fight between the displaced residents and the city that had destroyed their homes in the first place. Even the attempt to make it right became another grievance. For decades after, the Move bombing occupied a strange place in American memory, enormous and unforgettable to the people of Philadelphia, especially Black Philadelphia, and almost entirely unknown to the rest of the country. It did not enter the national story the way it should have. The city had dropped a bomb on its own citizens and burned a black neighborhood to the ground and killed 5 children and charged no one. And somehow this was not a permanent fixture of how Americans understood their own recent history. It faded the way these things are allowed to fade into a local memory and a set of anniversaries. It was not until 1920, decades later, that the city of Philadelphia formally apologized. In 2020, the Philadelphia City Council voted to issue an official apology for the bombing and to establish a day of remembrance, an acknowledgement at last in the city's own official voice that what had been done on Osage Avenue was wrong, 35 years after the fact. Long after the officials responsible were beyond the reach of any consequence, a council member drew a straight line in that apology, from the unresolved trauma of the bombing to the continuing pain in that same neighborhood, noting that the police killing of another black man, Walter Wallace Jr., had happened that very week, in the very same part of West Philadelphia. And there was one more grief still to come, a small one against the scale of it, but telling. Michael Ward, Birdie, Africa, the boy who had run burning out of that house as a child, one of only 2 survivors who had carried the physical and psychological scars of that day through his entire life, died in 2013. He was found drowned in a hot tub on a cruise ship. He had survived the fire his city set and lived on with it for 28 more years, and then he was gone too. So here is what remains. If you go to that part of West Philadelphia today, to the Cobbs Creek neighborhood, to the 6200 block of Osage Avenue, you will find an ordinary-looking street. The rubble was cleared long ago. Houses stand there. Life goes on, as it does. There is very little to tell you that on a spring evening in 1985, a helicopter hovered over this exact spot and dropped a bomb, and that the city let the fire burn until 11 people were dead and an entire neighborhood was gone. But it happened here, in America, in a major American city. Within the lifetimes of most of the people watching this, the police of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on a house full of families in a black neighborhood, and then stood back and let the fire consume 61 homes, and killed 11 people, including 5 children, and not one person was ever criminally charged for any of it. They dropped a bomb on their own city and called it a police operation. 11 people died, 5 of them children, and the street where it happened looks, today, like any other street, which may be the most American thing about the whole story. We build over it,